This computer. Okay, so that's our agenda and the talk about ISO 30401 that will start now. So what is the intent? I'm coming from a context of having read the document 10 or 15 times myself, so not enough to have memorized it or gotten really comfortable with it, but enough to sort of know the key pieces of it. So I'm basically pulling out what has stuck for me as 2 or 3 or 4 of the main key points and purposes. And if you're looking to just get an initial grasp of what's in the standard and what's it all about, I've pulled together a few headlines straight out of the document. So again, I hope it's acceptable that I've copied and pasted out of the copy that I paid for to screen. So this comes from page 5 and sort of the initial introduction of the standard itself. And I think it's actually worth reading out loud. The document itself declares the intent to be setting a sound knowledge management, I'll minimize my video here, sorry. Knowledge management principles and requirements with 2 subparts: as guidance for organizations that aim to be competent and optimizing the value of organizational knowledge, and as a basis for auditing, certifying, evaluating, and recognizing such competent organizations. So that's the intent, and I'm hoping already when we break into our small groups, that alone could be great discussion. What's missing from that intent? What agreements, disagreements? What would you add to the intent of the document? So I'll leave it at that. That's how it's stated in the document. The scope, I felt, was also very important. So this comes from page 1 of the document. This document sets requirements and provides guidelines for establishing, implementing, maintaining, reviewing, and improving an effective management system, notice that, for knowledge management in organizations. All the requirements of this document are applicable to any organization regardless of type, size, products, or services. So it's trying to be very, very broad, all over the world, any size, any industry. I literally searched for the word, the organization shall. Shall is like the magic word for right after that word, there are requirements that are listed. I'm going to do one thing really quickly. I'm going to hit mute all, because there's a little background. Yes. Okay, there we go. Apologies for that. So what I was going to add is there are 55 shall statements. Now, admittedly, I didn't step through every single one of them to make sure they truly are requirements, but my assumption would be that those 55 shall statements are requirements. The organization shall do this related to KM. The organization shall do this related to KM. So there's 55. I didn't feel comfortable putting all 55, and then I didn't put a specific example because I thought, well, if you share one, you kind of need to see all of them. So for now, all I want to say is it's meant to be very, very broad, and it does have some 55 specific guidance statements for you. That's the scope of ISO. Let me now skip forward to some key principles. Now, here's where I want to give a lot of credit to sort of the reason we're meeting right now is during KM Asia, several of us were there talking about it, and frankly, the whole room was talking about it, and Patrick Lamb gave a presentation on ISO 30401 on this standard. I was tweeting and a short blog about it as well, and the Knowledge Management Institute then requested, and there was a lot of sort of interest from the KMI community to talk about the standard, and then it was KMI that said, hey, why don't we run Knowledge Cafe on the topic? So I want to make sure I give credit to Patrick that he's obviously not the only one out there talking about it, but it is, in my perspective, exactly what spurred the reason we're all standing here today. So some of these, they're almost copy and paste from his, but I've tweaked them a little bit and tried to look at his presentation side by side with the standard and then sort of put my own view on it. So there are, let me think. I think this might actually be the entire list of principles. I don't think I took any out. But the right side of this document, I may have wordsmithed or shifted. So this may not be copy and paste from the document just to try and get it to fit onto one screen. certainly an option that I could step through each one of these, but I'm making a big assumption that most of us on the call are KM practitioners. So I'm really just showing this to you for, again, conversational purposes. Notice what they listed as principles. Notice your own emotional reactions, happy, sad, angry, whatever goes on for you about what's listed in the standard as principles and the international definition of those principles. I think it makes for great conversation. So if I were to call out one, nature of knowledge right at the top, intangible and complex, created by people. Agree, disagree, well, yeah, that's what's out there. So interesting. So those are the principles. Let's talk about the key definitions. Now, I do remember there is a long pages of definitions. We all know how complex and complicated and simple and chaotic that KM is. For that reason, part of the intent and the scope of ISO is to get some shared definitions out there. In fact, if I were to speak from a very positive point of view, to me, one of the most positive things about the KM standard is that it does put everything in an single international place for us to look at and say, how do we want to define KM? What are the pieces and parts of KM? So this is not the entire list of definitions, not even close. This is what, 6 out of the list that Patrick pulled out on his chart, and I happen to agree. It's a great example set of what's in the standard for definitions. The number 3 at the top of this chart is to say this is section 3 of the document. So section 1, if I go back a slide or 2 slides, was scope. Section 2 is blank. It says there's no normative references in this document. Section 3 is key definitions for pages. Again, for conversational purposes in this cafe, wanted to give you a few. Isn't it interesting how information is defined? How about the definition of knowledge? Agree or disagree with that? Isn't it interesting that words like collaboration and KM are defined in the standard, right? So yeah, this is all conversational purpose, not meant to be teaching you any of these things. So that's section 3 in the document. In that same area is now all the next sections. So on the left, rather than a separate slide for each one of these, I pulled section 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 all into one document to try and give you a high-level overview of what I found or what I sort of understood or really jumped out at me in each of those sections. So this one I think is worth spending a few minutes on. So the section 4 is context. In that section, you'll find organization shall lines and lots of detail around organizational purpose for KM, stakeholders of KM, scope and goals of KM, and I personally love how much KM culture and the sort of human side of KM. You know how easily this could have been caught up into a technology type standard, but culture is called out quite a bit right there in that first context section. Plus you saw it in principles and you saw it in key definitions. So that's out there. It also talks quite a bit of entire section on leadership. And you know, in KM, we've talked about for a long time, the reality of our world today is that most organizations are hierarchical. And in that sense, and from that point of view, leadership buy-in is the phrase I tend to hear the most, is just pretty critical. Not always necessary, but with great regularity, leadership just so important. So here are the kinds of subsections and system and organization shall comments that come out in that leadership category. Values around KM, commitment to KM, policy for KM, integration of KM into business processes. You know, we've talked about knowledge in the flow. KM roles and responsibilities, communications. I love that change management is called out. We've had that debate for years about, are we the same field? Are we different fields? What are the overlaps between KM and change? Metrics and continuous improvement are all specified in the leadership section. Plan has specific KM actions to address and opportunities, and Similar to quality standards, yes, there are some recommendations for all organizations in there, but it also relatively clearly states, and I'll look for Patricia to clean this up for me later, but to me, the way I read it, it also leaves it a bit open for you to come up with your plan and then be audited against, are you meeting your own plan? So in the States, we had Sarbanes-Oxley, which was exactly that. Sarbanes-Oxley did not tell you what you had to do. It told you had to write a plan, and then you were audited against, did you come up with your own plan for quality and control? So this has some similarity to that, as I understand it. Support, do you have resources for KM? Do you have competencies in KM, awareness, communications? And you'll notice documentation is in several sections. Have you documented the support for KM? Operations has its own section, back to KM plan, implementing control processes to meet the plan, and documentation around the plan. All of that in an operations section of the document. Performance evaluation, good old measurement and metrics, analysis, evaluation, audit, all of that falls into how well are you performing and evaluating yourself against that performance with support of auditors. And then improvement. So if you don't pass a section of the audit or you get feedback, what is the corrective action and how do you continually improve it? One thing I neglected to mention early on that's been sitting with me as I did this entire slide is it's been clear to me, and I'd like it to come up in conversation to validate for us, but this standard is not required. Every organization in the world is not required to have a KM standard or be compliant with ISO 30401. It is an optional standard, which is all the way back to the very first slide. You may have noticed the question I put out there was to ISO or not to ISO. It's your choice. So then it's an organizational choice. So maybe that spurs the obvious questions around what's the benefit of doing ISO? Is it competitive advantage? Is it employee engagement? Is it flow of knowledge? What would your organization consider to be some of the benefits or the reasons for looking deeper into these slides and this content we're looking at right now? So those are requirements. And then I think, the very last thing I want to talk about is KM culture, because again, I was so excited to see this in the document. You're probably familiar with the MAKE Awards, Most Admired Knowledge Enterprise, and how if I understand it correctly, they've basically gone away. Some other similar things are beginning to pop up. But I personally, when I was inside organizations, I used to go to the MAKE Awards, yes, to apply, but also just to look at their list of 5 or 10, what does good knowledge management look like? Or at least what is that award looking for? And it was just a good reminder every once in a while. So I love that this list is in the ISO standard because I've already started to use it as a great reminder. When I'm with my clients, hey, are we feeling comfortable about openly discussing issues and offering advice? Maybe, maybe not. Are we sharing, letter B, are we sharing knowledge and information openly and honestly? Maybe, right? So this is a nice reminder almost of what is KM and how to do KM, but just a reminder checklist that I've already found valuable. So again, it comes straight out of page 18 of the standard. I hope it's okay to share it. I've put it here for you. And with that, I will pass it over to the only certified ISO KM auditor to add some more clarity and definition and some pros and cons, or frankly, Patricia, whatever you'd like to add, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was a little flattered and shocked and surprised when John asked me if I would be willing to talk about this kind of thing, particularly when we had our very first conversation, in which he said, I don't like the standard. And I said, okay. And I think he was waiting for me to say something, and I'm not going to, because you don't have to like the standard. As he said, and as I told him before, you don't have to adopt the standard. The standard was developed by a group of knowledge management professionals around the world because they, like many people, have been struggling with what is CAM, what is good CAM, what should a CAM program have in it, what shouldn't it have in it, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And so it took them, Chris Collison, you're on the call still, aren't you? I mean, it took them, what, 2.5 years to come to any kind of an agreement?
It certainly took a while, yeah.
Yeah. And it wasn't pretty. It's like making sausage or making laws in the United States. I mean, one country says you've got to have A, and the next country says, no, you've got to have B. And then there's the mashing of teeth and pulling of hair and the drinking of beer and the final negotiations. I've written standards for the United States and, in fact, with the International Atomic Energy Agency for decades. And writing a standard is not easy. So what you come up with is basically the minimum. And the decision amongst the committee is if the minimum wasn't good enough, it wouldn't be the minimum. What is the standard? Well, John alluded to something, but and we cannot share the standard with you because of the rules of ISO. If any of you are ISO 9001 qualified, you know that you can't just willy-nilly make copies of the standard and pass them out in the street because ISO makes money by selling copies of the standard. Having said that, to buy the standard for the exorbitant fee of $138 US, I don't think is going to break anyone's bank. But I will say something right out of the standard, which I can read to you, but I cannot give to you. Each organization will craft a knowledge management approach with respect to its own business and operational environment, reflecting their specific needs and desired outcomes. It doesn't say you have to hire a high-powered consultant. It doesn't say you have to follow a specific method. It doesn't say you have to be certified. It just says you've got to figure out what you want to do and go do it. To elaborate on that, it says there is no one knowledge management solution that fits all organizations within all contexts. Well, if you're a CAM professional, you know that. Organizations may develop their own approach to the scope of knowledge and knowledge management and how to implement these efforts based on their own needs and their own context. So, what does the standard do? The standard defines definitions that everyone can see, so you know what one person's talking about versus the other person. It talks about the intent, which John went over. There are some principles, and to be honest with you, they're pretty general. Where the rubber meets the road is when you get into the actual standard language itself, where they define, and I think, Chris, am I right, is it 57 shall statements? Which sounds horrible, but
55, I think, but we came 55? Up with 57 questions.
Well, okay, how about if I buy you a beer, we'll discuss the other two that I think there are and you think there aren't. So let me read you one, so you understand one of the shalls. I see we've already lost one person. That's okay. Oh no, she just leaned over sideways. Section 4.2 says, understanding the needs and expectation of interested parties. The organization shall determine the interested parties that are relevant to the knowledge management system. What does that mean? It means whatever you think it means. If you're a big organization, you can do a stakeholders needs analysis. If you're a small organization, it might mean everybody sits around the table and talks about it. The standard tells you what needs to be done, but not how. The how is left to the organization. So let's talk about the pros and cons, because I know John is wanting to start the discussion. Why bother? First of all, it's not required. You don't have to do this. Just like you don't have to do ISO 9001, you don't have to meet any of the standards around. Well, the federal standards that are required, you do have to meet. But ISO, it's a voluntary thing. You don't have to do this. So why even bother? Well, if you want to have a nice coherent discussion with some of your KM colleagues around the world, you at least have definitions that you can use. So you know your apples and apples as opposed to apples and oranges. It provides an assessment tool, which you may or may not adopt. I mean, you could take a look at the standard, spend all of $138, which is probably about the same amount of money you'd spend for dinner for two, and see what ISO came up with. I know already I've been getting some inquiries from people, and typically not in the United States. People in the United States typically just do it the way they do it. But I've had several inquiries now, and I think, Chris, you have also, outside the US about, well, when can we do some kind of a preliminary audit? Well, just because you look at the standard and you decide you're going to try to adopt it doesn't mean you have to go for certification. There's a whole litany of things you can do. It does help provide a framework and a structure in which you can look at your KM program and see, gee, are we hitting all of the facets that the KM committees think we should or not? And if you're not going for certification, you don't have to, but it does make you think. It makes you look at your program in a much more critical light. You can find things that you're doing well. You may find things that are missing in your program that maybe would help you have a better program, make your program more effective. And already, at least in Asia, I'm hearing that, yeah, we want to get certified as soon as possible. How soon can you get here? Well, you know, I have a life, but when you ask them, why do you want to do this? It's because we want to say that we have a KM program that passes the ISO standard. Therefore, we handle our knowledge better. Therefore, we're going to deliver for you in a much more effective and more efficient manner. So some companies are viewing this as a competitive advantage. You may not. I mean, if you're Apple, what kind of competitive advantage do you need? You've got all this stuff out there already. So again, it's not required. It's a tool like any other business development tool that you can use to take a look at how you're doing, what you're doing, and determine if you're doing it the way you really want to do it or if it could be improved. The cons. Well, you have to pay for the standard, and you can't just, you know, get a copy of the standard and put it through your Xerox machine or your photocopying machine, make 1 billion copies and hand it out. There are rules from ISO as to how many copies you can make, whether or not you can hand them out. And I'm glad, John, that you didn't go through all of the requirements, because if you had, I would have had to stop you and say, you cannot read those things, all of them, without doing something about the ISO royalties and whatnot. So I would caution you, be careful what you do there. Or if you're going to do it, don't do it around me, because I would have to report you or I would lose my certification. Okay. The other thing about audits is if you go for a certification audit, it can be time consuming. There are 50-something odd shall statements that the auditor will have to look at each one of those aspects of your program. Now, if your program doesn't have all of those, I wouldn't go for certification. What I would do is I would take a look at the standard. I would if I were running a company, I would pay the $138, and no, I do not get a commission. I would pay the $138 and I would look at the standard and then make up my mind as to whether or not I wanted to just use it as an internal document, so for an internal audit or an internal assessment or whatever, or if I wanted to do maybe a preliminary audit, have somebody come in and take a look to see how you would fare if you went for a certification audit, and then, or not. And then if you wanted to go for a certification audit, make real sure. Right now I'm the only one, but I'm not going to be the only one for long, I don't think. Make sure you find somebody who is certified. Because if you don't, and you have somebody who comes and say, oh yeah, I can do that audit for you, okay. If you ever get questioned, you're up the creek without a paddle. I mean, well, who was this person? Well, Joe Schmo came and they looked at the standard and they said, we meet it. And so he said, we're certified. Certified by whom? To what standard and what process did they use? That's a trick question. What process did you use? Because their ISO, of course, has a process standard for how you do these things. So that's a whole nother issue. So yeah, it's not straightforward. It can be costly depending on how much the auditor decides to charge you. And no, I have no idea how much it would charge because I haven't come up with the audit plan yet. How long would it take? That's going to depend on if you're a GM with multi offices around the world, or if you're a mom and pop shop that only has, franchises in one city. It depends on how complex it is. The principles, however, are the same. And the bottom line there is, does your program do the minimum that the standard says you should do? And do you do it the way that you said you were going to do it? And is it effective? That's the bottom line. And with that, I'll turn it back to John.
Unmute quickly. Yeah, thank you. Amazing as always. Let me stop recording now, which I think I have to stop sharing first.